All right, I'm so glad to have back on Bad Faith podcast Shir Hever. He is a scholar of Israel's occupation, apartheid, and genocide. And also, you might remember him from his appearance last year, at which time he was the coordinator for the BDS movement's military embargo campaign. And it can also offer some thoughts about the continued BDS movement. Welcome back to Bad Faith podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brianna.
All right. First off, I want to address something that we talked about on your last appearance on Bad Faith podcast. I was re-listening to it this morning, and it was interesting to reflect on our back and forth about how we thought Joe Biden versus Donald Trump were going to continue funding if there was going to be any break in Biden's policy by Donald Trump, who was at the time running on sort of an America First line and promising that the war would be, quote unquote, wrapped up quickly, et cetera. I do wonder if there's anything surprising from your perspective on how Donald Trump has continued to litigate this genocide.
Well, I think it's not just him, right? He has a whole team of people working with him and the whole GOP and his advisors and so on. So I think there's a certain tension now between Trump and the way that he speaks and the people around him, because Netanyahu has been very unapologetic by referring to Trump basically as his lackey, something that I did find surprising that didn't offend Trump because he's a very easily offendable person. So when Netanyahu refers to him as his puppet, then Trump would be maybe as a 2-year-old kind of personality that he has would intentionally try to prove him wrong. But what we saw last month in June when Israel attacked Iran, it was very clear, especially to the Israelis, that they were completely unprepared for this war, that they didn't have the tools, the weapons, the ability to achieve any of the goals that Netanyahu promised for the war. And then Trump basically jumped whenever Netanyahu said that he should. I think this caused this tension because a lot of people around Trump were saying, this is not what we wanted. We didn't vote for Netanyahu to be the president. We voted for Trump to be the president. And I do think it's interesting to see where this would be going, especially, I'm not an expert on U.S. politics. I'm sure you know much better than I do. But what I can tell you is that in Israel, this is a topic that's discussed all the time. And a lot of the pundits, a lot of the analysts are really scared, waiting for this moment in which there's going to be a pivot. And the U.S. administration is going to say, we had enough. And every time Trump makes a little statement, and he just did about a week ago when he said that Palestinian children are hungry and it should stop. And a lot of Israelis were scared into thinking, oh, maybe this is the moment in which Trump changes his policy. And a couple of days later, Trump imposed 15% tariffs on Israel. And again, a lot of Israelis said, oh, maybe this is the moment. So I'm not sure. We are in a very volatile moment, in a very changing time. And maybe it's happening. Maybe it'll take more time. But certainly the whole strategy that Israel has, the whole reason that there are still Israelis who believe that there could be a future for the state of Israel, is that they think there is a future in which the U.S. will continue to support Israel unconditionally and forever.
It's funny because from the American perspective, I also cynically share that position, that as much as I obviously wish it weren't the case, I think those of us, especially on the left, perceive Donald Trump's sort of vague gestures at caring about the humanitarian crisis as being mostly a sort of, cover your tuchus sort of politicking. There has been quite pointedly a shift over the last, I'd say, 2 weeks or so, where even Israel's staunchest defenders have felt compelled to put out statements that acknowledge the famine in Gaza. It seems as though the imagery is undeniably horrible in a way that somehow overcomes people's resistance to all of the imagery that we've seen over the past almost 2 years now, and has compelled even, a sort of a softening. Now, that softening is very caveated, right? It still often tries to put the blame for the famine on Hamas. It claims frequently that Hamas is either stealing aid, or that Israel is trying to get more aid in, or that somehow this crisis doesn't fall at the feet of Israel. But there is a tonal shift that suggests that there is some insecurity politically among people on both sides of the aisle about their choice to continue funding Israel's genocide. That being said, the dollars continue to flow, and it does seem like the rhetorical shift is in service of enabling the money to keep going despite public disapproval of the humanitarian crisis in and of itself. So that's from the American side. Could you tell us from the Israeli side what the sentiment is, what the reactions are to the famine? You seem to characterize the Israeli public as being concerned that Trump will no longer provide funding. Is the anxiety and frustration against Donald Trump, or is it at all against Netanyahu for continuing a policy in the occupation and genocide of Gaza that requires so much funding and military support?
It's both. But yeah, I think that there's definitely a shift in the Israeli public discourse with these horrible pictures that we're seeing. Unfortunately, the starvation of Palestinians is not new. Israel has been embarking on starvation from day one of this genocide, when the Israeli Ministry of Defense at the time, Yoav Gallant, said that they will receive no water, no food, no medicine, and indeed moved to execute this. But it did take time for this horror to manifest to this level. And of course, the reason that we've reached this point where these horrible, horrible pictures are flooding our social media accounts and even mainstream newspapers and television channels, is that Israel waged a campaign against UNRWA. UNRWA, the UN Refugee Works Agency, which is in charge of Palestinian refugees and providing food, is the only organization that has the ability to feed the population in Gaza in a moment of crisis and in an emergency. They have the knowledge and the capacity and the contact with the population, so they can do it. Israel knows this, so they tried to frame UNRWA as an organization that is in some way close to Hamas, which is completely false. They've tortured confessions out of UNRWA employees in order to force them to say that they were actually Hamas agents, which is, you can torture somebody to say whatever you want, and then use that as evidence to demand that UNRWA will lose its funding, and then proceeded to legislate against UNRWA. So by doing this, they cut off the aid to Gaza. And once they did this, they brought in the GHF. And the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which everybody knows, is an organization that is a joint US-Israeli organization. The funding, we don't know exactly, but we know that it is controlled by Israel and the United States, the policy, and their humanitarian distribution centers have become death traps, where people are hungry and they come to receive food, and then the Israeli soldiers wait for them with loaded weapons and open fire. And this caused, of course, a massive intensification of the hunger and the suffering. Now these pictures are starting to get to Israelis, and there are still a lot of Israelis who believe that the pictures are all AI generated. It's all fake. The whole world is
really?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And one conversation that really shocked me when in one of the Israeli podcasts by an Israeli journalist who's also a professor at a university in New York. So he travels between Israel and the US quite a lot. And he said that he believes that the average American knows more about what's happening in Gaza than the average Israeli. And I thought this was mind-boggling. I don't know if you agree, or because my impression is that the vast majority of the US public is not particularly interested in the Middle East. But It's very, very relevant to every Israeli because it's happening, a few minutes from their homes. And nevertheless, they live in this bubble of delusion.
I mean,
But there's another thing, because you
sorry.
mentioned, yeah, sorry, you want to say something?
No, I don't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Because you mentioned this accusation as if Hamas were stealing the aid. And this is something that the Israeli propaganda machine has been trying to pump for quite a while. But now I'm hearing a very interesting conversation. And this conversation goes through two stages. One stage is in which a very small number, a handful of brave Israeli journalists, are facing up to that accusation and saying it just doesn't make sense. Because just do the math. There are 2.3 million people in Gaza. They need 3 meals a day. The amount of food that needs to go into Gaza would fill giant hangars. It's just the volume of it is unfathomable. And if Hamas is stealing all of these thousands of tons of food, where are they putting it? And if the Israeli military would want to argue that they somehow have underground bunkers where they can hide all this food, then how come the Israeli military didn't give the slightest shred of evidence of any of this? They never had any evidence. So this is something that this journalist said, and there is no counter argument. Nobody can stand up to this argument. But this was only the first stage of this conversation. The second stage of the conversation, and I think we're now moving into this second stage, is when somebody is saying, what is your counter argument to the accusation that Hamas is stealing the food or something like this? Or what are you? The answer is, I'm not even going to go into this conversation because people are being starved to death intentionally. Israel has the responsibility, and it doesn't matter. All of these conversations about technicalities and it's just an act of genocide, and the moral imperative to stop it is beyond everything else that you can say in this conversation. No need for devil's advocate arguments. And this is the stage, I think, where the whole argument breaks down. Because I also feel, sick to my stomach when I have to give the arguments. Why is it not true that Hamas is stealing the food, and how to counter this argument? Because I don't think we should. I don't think that this is something we should have to say at all.
Yeah, I saw a news clip on MSNBC yesterday of a woman giving talking points that were so vile and such gish gallop and such speedy back-to-back lies. And I think it was Peter Beinart who was trying to push back against them.
Well, look, whether it happens or not, frankly, the truth is Israel should have never left Gaza, because before 2005, we did not have a terrorist state. We had a booming economy. We had equality for the sexes. We didn't have gays being thrown off rooftops. But when Israel dragged every last man, woman, and child out of Gaza and exhumed the dead bodies because they knew what Hamas would do with it, we had a terror state, and that's a big mistake, and the world is yet to admit that. And the real question is, why is the world preventing Gazans from leaving Gaza? Why are they insisting that they remain as human hostages for Hamas and as civilian human shields? And the third point really is, are they refugees or are they not refugees? Because if Gazans are Palestinian refugees, then Gaza is not their home, and they should be relocated so that they are not used by Hamas as human shields. If Gaza is their home, then the entire premise upon which the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict is based and the right of return is false. The only people being deliberately starved in Gaza are the hostages right now. You look at Avitar David. He looks like a concentration camp survivor who was forced to dig his own grave. When the body of Eden Yerushalmi, after she was murdered, was returned, she was 70 pounds. Contrast that to the pictures, these, I'll say, artistic pictures of children, most of them with diseases.
Really, Brooke?
Yes, really.
I mean,
yes,
really,
you're propaganda pictures of these children. You never see pictures of adults. And famine is not selective, Peter. You can't have a child who's starving and then the mother is
Brooke, are we really,
overweight or the brother is fully fed.
The picture of Aviatar David was horrifying. Are we really debating whether people are starving in Gaza?
No, we're debating who is responsible. No, but
because it sounds like you're saying that these are made-up pictures.
Who is responsible
for
any food shortages
Okay, so let's
in Gaza.
acknowledge that there are people starving in Gaza.
Is Hamas responsible?
Why don't you?
Is Hamas
I think you should let me finish.
The way that you let me finish last time. Does Hamas steal the food and use it as a food weapon?
You just spoke for a long time. Let me just say something.
Does Hamas steal food?
The Palestinians in Gaza are indeed refugees. It's true. They are the descendants, most of them, of families that were expelled from Israel in 1948. So if Gaza is not habitable for them, because Israel has destroyed most of the schools, most of the churches, most of the mosques, most of the bakeries, most of the agriculture, most of the universities, then they should be allowed to return to the places from which they're from, which is not Burundi or Somalia or Rwanda. It's Israel. Right? If you want to give them a place to go out of Gaza, allow them to go back to the places from which their families were expelled.
I think you have a problem with cause and effect. You like to blame Israel for everything. Israel did not destroy their hospitals, destroy their schools.
No.
The schools and the hospitals that I've been to have been used as places for rocket depots, and most of those hospitals are used as Hamas for their headquarters. Hamas is responsible. When you have your headquarters under a hospital and you shoot rockets into a civilian
where is Israel's military
population,
headquarters located?
And you shoot...
I have a question. Where is Israel, the Kiryat? Where is Israel's military locators headquarters? Is it in a remote area?
Israel has military
headquarters
answer the question. Everywhere.
Where is Israel?
Targets.
No.
Are they
you didn't answer my question. Where is Israel's military? It is in downtown Tel Aviv. So let me say that again.
Israel's military in Tel Aviv.
You got to let me finish. Israel's military headquarters is in downtown Tel Aviv. Right? Many of the apartment buildings in Tel Aviv house Israeli generals. Under international law, you don't have the right to destroy the schools around Israel's military headquarters or to
Israel
destroy.
Does
no, let me
not
finish.
Shoot rockets from downtown Tel Aviv into civilian populations.
Israel has its military infrastructure deeply embedded within the civilian infrastructure as well. And in international law, it would be a war crime to destroy a hospital or an apartment building in Tel Aviv because an Israeli general is there. Similarly, it is a violation of international law to destroy a hospital or university or school in Gaza just because you believe that there are Hamas.
It is a violation of international law to use civilians as human shields. Can we agree on that?
Yes, and do
you support the temporary relocation of Gazans so that they're not used as human?
God forbid I do not. I don't want Palestinians expelled again. The Palestinians were expelled in 1948. You want to expel them again?
No.
That's a war crime,
That's
bro.
not what I said.
Hang on one sec.
Temporary. You think Israel's going to allow them back if they leave? Come on.
All right.
It was so overwhelming and so cruel. I had to delete a tweet. I was like, if I tweet what I really want to tweet about this woman, they're going to kick me off Twitter at best and arrest me at worst. So let me just not engage. But there's still stuff like that out there in the media, right? Like, so I get the urge to say, and I believe this, like that we're past some of this arguing, right? There's a level of desperation to some of the arguments, and at this point, at least in the United States, the public opinion has swung wildly against Israel, and nobody really believes this pablum anymore. There was another sort of desperate attempt by, maybe we'll clip it in here as well, by a sort of, I don't know how he defines himself. If I ever characterize him as right-leaning, people get very upset about it, but he exists in a right-leaning ecosystem. His name is Coleman Hughes. He's been a guest on the show before, and he offered another one of these sort of pat defenses of Israel that also included just the most obvious, like 2022 era Hezbollah. That being said, I think that you were right that the American public, especially in the last couple of weeks, has been made aware of or confronted directly with the starvation campaign, with front page stories on the New York Times of emaciated children and the like. Like, they are aware of that. But I am still confused by the idea that Americans might know more than Israelis, because we often reflect on the fact that outlets like Haaretz are willing to say the honest thing about what's going on in Israel in a way that American papers are often, up until this point, have been unwilling to do. Or when they do, they bury it deep down in an article. They caveat everything up the wazoo. They use passive voice so that it's not, Israel kills or Israel starves. It's people are starving, this number of deaths, etc. And the Israeli media seems to be, for whatever reason, more direct and honest, printing stories about the Hannibal Directive, all of these kinds of things. So what's going on there? Are people in Israel not reading outlets like Haaretz? Is there just a huge volume of other kinds of media that people are consuming? How is it that folks wouldn't know?
I think that's part of the problem of maybe our weakness in the left. When instead of saying Palestinians are telling us something and we believe them, we say, but even there are some Israelis who support them. And because of that way of saying, oh, look, there's also Peter Beinart, who comes from the Jewish community of the United States, who is willing to criticize what Israel is doing, instead of saying, well, let's listen to the victims, to the Palestinians first. And because of this kind of logic, Haaretz, as a newspaper, became so much of a symbol of good journalism, which is detached from reality, unfortunately. Haaretz is actually a very liberal newspaper in the sense that it believes it will sell more copies and be more successful if it gives room for people from the left and from the right to speak and argue with each other. So you have some journalists there who are considered more pro-Palestinian, and some journalists who are settlers and support the colonization of Palestine, and even more. Haaretz, after October 7, dropped the leftist journalists, just dropped them, or silenced them, and became part of the machine of propaganda, and became, until today, it's 2 years, almost 2 years since October 7, Haaretz never published an apology for publishing the story about the 40 beheaded babies that never existed. And even U.S. newspapers did acknowledge that this turned out to be false. But no, not all of them.
I wouldn't go that far. I don't know that I have ever seen. Remember, this wasn't just like a thing that newspapers printed either. This is a thing that Joe Biden, as the president, repeated from the podium.
Yes. And even the New York Times, one of the most pro-Israeli newspapers in the U.S., has published an article saying that they've investigated and found that there is no truth behind this claim. Okay, that's not an apology. It's a clarification.
If you say that happens, I believe that it might have been printed in an article in the New York Times. I don't remember reading, I'm going to be so honest with you. I don't remember that. I do remember a little bit more of a mea culpa around the mass rape story with the New York Times, because they were the ones that were really the vanguard of that story, and they got so much pushback from it internally within their own newsroom. But the 40 beheaded babies thing, I think, I still hear, maybe I want to say even in the bombastic clip that I just referred to on MSNBC with Peter Beinart, I want to say that 40 beheaded babies was even a part of that woman's tirade. It's very much alive. I would guess that even though public opinion in the United States has swung against Israel, that, well, let me not make up numbers, but a significant number, almost all probably, of the people who still support Israel believe that 40 beheaded babies stat to be true.
This is very depressing to hear, but I'm willing to take your word on it. I'm just saying that Haaretz is not all it's worked out to be. And now there are different voices in Haaretz, and there are some people who are calling it a genocide on the pages of Haaretz, and Haaretz allows them to say this on their pages, with something they didn't allow before. They also continue to publish people who deny the genocide. And cast doubt on the numbers, or cast doubt on the intention of the Israeli government, even though it was stated so intently. You've used the word hasbara before, and I don't know if all your viewers and listeners are familiar with this term. Hasbara is how Israel calls its own propaganda machine, but it's a word in Hebrew that means explanation. So when they translate it into English, they call it public diplomacy. They mean that this is their effort to do public relations for the Israeli policy to convince the world to support it. And there's been a recent article by one of Israel's senior foreign office officials who is in charge of those Hasbara projects, who said, we're beyond the point of Hasbara. Hasbara doesn't make sense anymore. We need to change the term and start working on Toda'ah. Toda'ah is a Hebrew word that means consciousness. So, because you can't explain the unexplainable, you can't explain atrocities and say we had a reason for murdering children. That's not something that you could explain. But Toda'ah, which means consciousness, is something you can engineer by using disinformation as the story of the 40 beheaded babies in order to make people or shape people's consciousness into just believing in fake facts. So I think really now they're saying that their only way of doing foreign policy is brainwashing. I mean, this is what they are saying in their own words. And I think that it does show that they've lost hope in their own cause.
That's so insightful. I want to play for you this Coleman Hughes clip, actually, because that's exactly what it feels like. When I say it's like 2022 era Hasbara, it feels like their heart isn't even in it anymore. It feels like they're just saying things that are trying to cement the idea that like Israel's the good guys and Palestinians are the bad guys. It's not even the facts of it are really secondary. Here, let me pull up this clip.
I believe that in the war between Israel and Hamas, the Israelis are the good guys and Hamas are the bad guys. That may seem like a cartoonish way to describe the situation, or it might seem like an obscene opinion given the images of emaciated children that you've probably seen over the past few weeks, but it's still the truth. And it's a truth that's incredibly easy to lose sight of amid the day-to-day coverage of this war. In my view, the deepest tragedy in the war right now is that both sides have committed war crimes, and in both cases, those war crimes are falling on Palestinian civilians. The truth, of course, is that every war features war crimes, but usually each army commits those crimes against the enemy's population. In this case, the Palestinians of Gaza have received a double dose of the excesses of each side. But here's the crucial point. That doesn't make both sides morally equal. Let me begin by making something clear. When I say that the Israelis are the good guys in this war, I'm not saying that everything the IDF does is justifiable. Far from it. And I'm not saying that Israeli soldiers haven't committed war crimes. Certainly they have. What I mean is that Israel's goals as a country are far more benign and ethical than Hamas's goals. Israel's goal is to live in peace with its neighbors. Now, you can focus on the far-right faction within Israel that wants more than that, but it's just that. It's one faction within a democracy, no more representative of the will of Israelis than AOC or Marjorie Taylor Greene represents the will of Americans. By and large, Israelis don't want to conquer Gaza. In fact, they left Gaza voluntarily in 2005, and they don't want to wipe Gaza off the map. If they wanted that, they could have done it any time in the last several decades. With their advantage and firepower, they could do it now in a matter of weeks. And you should ask yourself why they don't. Hamas, on the other hand, does want to conquer Israel and wipe it off the map. And they would be happy to do what they did on October 7th to the entire country. That's what I mean when I say that the two sides in this war are not the same. There is a huge moral asymmetry between them, and that matters.
Whew. Okay, Shir. I mean, where do you even start?
Yeah, well, I see what you mean by 2022, Asbara, but I this is also a very strong argument that this Israeli journalist may want to take into account, that the Americans have a better perception of reality than Israelis, because this is very clearly a very delusional statement. Let me just say very, very directly, there's been a large poll in Israel recently. 80% of Israelis say that they want to expel the entire population of Gaza and permanently annex Gaza. That's 80%, not a small number. 60% said further that the Palestinian citizens of Israel, meaning the 22% of Israeli citizens who are Palestinians and have Israeli citizenship, should have their citizenship revoked and be expelled from the country as well. So moving from apartheid to basically creating a pure Jewish-only space in Israel. And 40% have said that the Israeli military in Gaza should follow biblical rules of exterminating the population in a way that the Bible prescribes, the killing of the entire population, entire families, including children, and even destroying like the property and killing the livestock so that nothing can remain to attest to the existence of these people. This is the state of affairs in Israeli society in terms of the public opinion. I think that it is interesting that Israelis are able at the same time to deny the facts that are happening and support them. I mean, this is a kind of mental gymnastics that I don't know if Congressman Coleman is able to do. It would be interesting to see, because if he's saying Israel has benign intentions and has killed 18,000 Palestinian children and is starving the population of Gaza intentionally, but it has benign intentions, I don't know if he's able to reconcile those things. I guess the only way he could make a coherent statement is if he denies the facts. Now, I think Israelis are aware of the facts in the sense that they support them in a very literal way. They say it's good that food is not brought into Gaza. There are Israelis who stand on the fence between Israel and Gaza on the checkpoints to physically block trucks carrying food to make sure that no food gets into Gaza. So they are actively aware of the starvation policy. They're enacting it. They're volunteering to starve Palestinians. And at the same time, they say, oh, we didn't hear there's any hunger in Gaza. So this is, I think, a different kind. Maybe I'm wrong, but to me, it seems like a different state of mind that the Israelis have than the Americans.
It feels like the American goal at this point, and I think it's represented so well by Coleman Hughes' clip there. I don't take it as trying to deny the facts, because the facts are here. The facts are obvious. It's trying to say that despite the facts, Israel means well, Palestinians don't, Hamas doesn't. And this has been the kind of the thread throughout, that Israel is people like us. They share our values. They're a democracy. They're Western. Tacitly, they're white. Palestinians are not like us. They're barbaric. And this is where the beheaded babies and the rape stories come in, to try to say something more than just killing, because Israel's killing, right? You got to distinguish. If Israel's killing way more people than Hamas is, then you got to do something other than death numbers. You got to make the character of the death somehow more quote unquote barbaric and vile. So you say 40 beheaded babies, mass rapes, etc. And that we got to stick with our allies and people like us because they're people like us. And that at the end of the day, they want what we want. And we don't have to put too fine a point on what we want. And in the shift where you see people like Coleman Hughes, who there is reporting for the Free Press, which is an ostensibly free speech outlet, I put that in quotation marks, founded by a notorious American Zionist named Barry Weiss. The fact that they're willing to say, like, they'll acknowledge, yes, there's starvation happening. Yes, people have died, but to me, it seems like a big step, like a big concession in trying to rally the troops, not around the idea that Israel isn't doing war crimes. He admits they're doing war crimes, but hey, he says that's war and both sides do war crimes. So what side are you actually on, all things being equal, when all things are, of course, not equal? So again, like I see that as a kind of a like evidence of sort of Zionist Hezbollah vulnerability. But I am so cynical at this point that I don't know that will reflect any change in the reality on the ground from a U.S. political perspective. And you're already seeing sort of Democratic politicians trying to grasp onto some rhetorical ground that will enable them to appease a public that does not want American fingerprints on this horror. Yeah. While still running for office in 2028, right? You see all the kind of the liberal candidates trying to figure out a way to acknowledge that the public doesn't want them involved while understanding that the American duopoly is not going to change course on this. So, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's not very smart what he's doing because if he wants to run for office in 2028 and...
Well, not him. He's not a politician. He's just a pundit. But okay. Other people. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean... Anyone who puts these kinds of positions on record, you have a clip, would be then named as somebody who stood by and shut his eyes to the atrocities committed, and that everyone knows about them, and they are happening live streamed, and these people are just not acknowledging them, and not only not acknowledging them, but supporting them. The U.S. is giving the money and giving the weapons and making it possible. This is, I think, not a very smart position to have if you understand that this is not a sustainable political situation. It's not going to be like an eternal, ongoing genocide in Gaza for all time. It's going to end. And when it ends, there will be a major accountability and major... And I think that this genocide will be remembered for generations.
Do you think that's true? Not the remembered part, but the accountability part.
Yeah. I don't think it's likely that the accountability will reach everyone because the complicity in the West is so deep. And right now, I'm speaking to you from Germany, you're in the United States. These are the two major countries that make it, that enable the genocide. And these countries are also just happen to be two of the most powerful countries in the world. The US, certainly. Germany is the most powerful country in Europe. So it doesn't seem likely that these countries will face accountability. But it also didn't seem likely, in other historical examples, when the strong are supporting atrocities. But eventually, when these atrocities end, there is a process where I do think that that it's not going to be possible for Germany to just continue doing things normally when a lot of lawyers will say, there's a part of the German constitution that says that German laws are subject to international law. International law is above German law, something that the US doesn't have. Yeah. But Germany certainly has it because Germany is the reason that there is international law in the world. And people who violated those laws, how are they going to defend themselves in court? So they might find some way of, taking some part of the government, not everybody, to be like the scapegoats and to bear some kind of punishment for all of the officials and politicians who were complicit in it, and it's not maybe very practical from a political power point of view to make everybody accountable. But you can already see the panic. The panic is spreading. And the panic is, of course, much clearer in countries that are not Germany and the United States. But it's also like, Norway, which is a very, very rich country, is now discovered that in their pension fund, which is the biggest pension fund in the world, it's worth trillions, they're invested in an Israeli company, a very small one called Bet Shemesh Engines, which makes the engines for jet fighters and drones that are used to bomb Gaza. And the Norwegian pension fund has already divested from the big Israeli arms companies and also from some US arms companies. But now they missed this one. And the response has been panic because, oh no, if they're investing in this company, that makes them complicit. This is illegal. People could really go to jail for this. So now Norway announced that they're going to review all of their investments in Israel. They're going to check all the companies, whether they're armed companies or not, because maybe these companies are somehow involved in the genocide and they don't want to be held accountable. So you see this in Germany. You see Slovenia, which announced a full military embargo in Israel, the first country in Europe. You see Spain, which is calling on the European Union to end not only arms trade with Israel, but also the trade agreement with Israel, to suspend it. Belgium and Ireland joined that call. Ireland is the first European country that bans products from the settlements. So, this is moving forward. And in Germany, they're saying, oh, we are the only ones who are not taking any action. And this is dangerous. And I've spoken to some German politicians who are very urgently trying to change this course of action and to say that we need to stop trading with Israel, stop sending weapons to Israel, and so on, because of the legal and moral problems that this entails. And when they operate within the German political system to do so, I'm talking about elected politicians, even from the coalition, like not some marginal opposition members, they are confronted with a wall of silence. And they don't get the data, like which weapons are being sent and how many and so on. It's hidden from them because they know it's illegal. They know there will be accountability, so they're hiding it. This is not how somebody acts if they act out of confidence that they can get away with it. This is how somebody acts when they know they're a criminal and they're in trouble. So I think this is something that we do need to acknowledge. The accountability is not something that we just fantasize. If our opponents are afraid of it, then it's there.
So I really do appreciate those examples. I do. I guess my concern is, what about America and what about Israel? The statistics that you read, and I'm glad you brought those up because I was planning to get into some of those as well. Because there is an effort, part of the kind of Hezbollah narrative in the United States is to say, well, it's all Netanyahu's fault. This isn't what the people of Israel want. This is Netanyahu's war. This is a phrase that is used by conservatives and people like Bernie Sanders, our left flank alike, who refuses to use the word genocide and who consistently frames this as the responsibility of Netanyahu in a narrow and singular way. And so the concern is that the move is to say, it's him. Once he goes away, we can act like this isn't a political environment where from day one they've been saying they were going to do collective punishment. From day one, they haven't been evoking Amalek in these sort of biblical justifications for annihilation, that we don't know what it is when we see UNRWA accused of participating on October 7th, mere hours after the criminal court says that it's a plausible genocide happening in Gaza in a moment that is clearly retaliatory, but which most of the Western world just goes along with and defunds the humanitarian program that we all know is the only thing sustaining Palestinian life at this point in Gaza. And so I am skeptical, given that all of this has been executed very openly and not just by Netanyahu, that in Israel and in America, there will be accountability. And what does the end game look like in Israel? Because what it feels like from my perspective is that a decision was made that this is the last bite of the apple that you're going to get. So we're going to do final solution stuff in Palestine, and that the after won't even, I don't want to awful lot. You know what I mean? I don't want to speak into existence, but that it doesn't matter about accountability. It doesn't matter about the next day if the goal of annihilating Palestine and Palestinians is achieved.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important that you raise this, because we need to make it very clear that this is that we shouldn't give credibility to this genocidal fantasy. The genocidal fantasy that the Nazis had, that they could eliminate all the Jews in the world, was not achieved. You know, even though the Nazis committed the most atrocious genocide of the 20th century, then you could they were not able to eliminate all the Jews, and they were not able to eliminate or the Sinti and Roma, which they also tried to genocide. And sorry, they didn't try to genocide; they did genocide. This is part of the problem of the word genocide, because if you think about homicide, when somebody commits homicide, the victim is dead. Genocide sounds very similar, but it is not the same word. Genocide is all about the intent. Genocide is about the attempt to kill, but there is no genocide, at least not in modern times, that is successful in completely eliminating. And the genocide in Rwanda was really horrifying in killing 10% of the Tutsi. And that this is really unfathomable. Israel hasn't yet killed 10% of the people in Gaza, certainly not 10% of the Palestinians overall. The word Amalek is a clear indication of that intent. And what you're saying is two different things. One is that the US is getting away with everything and is not facing accountability. And this is what empire is about. It's about hegemony. It's about nobody can tell you what to do, and nobody can hold you accountable. And the US is the global power that we are facing now, but it's in decline, and nothing is pulling it down faster than Israel. This is something that I think more and more Americans are realizing. Whether the US will change its position in time, like Biden did in Afghanistan, throw the Karzai regime to the wolves, and in order to save the U.S. empire, or what Nixon did in Vietnam, and so on. Throw your allies away so you can preserve the empire. Will Trump do the same to Israel? I don't know, but I don't think that I'm equipped to answer this question. But I can tell you something about Netanyahu and about positioning Netanyahu as the cause of all evil. We shouldn't discount the tremendous influence that this one individual has, because Netanyahu is indeed a very, very cunning politician. He thinks several steps ahead, and his way with words and his ability to sway the masses is unparalleled. That doesn't mean that, when Netanyahu goes away, then the problem is solved. Of course not. Netanyahu is a creature of apartheid, a creature of colonialism. He's just very, very good at it. But it certainly didn't invent any of this. But what Netanyahu did do is he opened the gates of hell, in the sense that those forces within Israel that were so fanatic, so extremist, so racist, that they were not even furthering the cause. They were self-destructive to the Israeli system of control over the Palestinians. Those people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who were, in the far, far right of Israel, Netanyahu just said, in order to be in power, I need to bring these people into the mainstream, into the consensus, open the doors and ride the tiger, so to speak. So once he did this, you can't put the tiger back into the cage. This is now a situation in which Israel is in a self-destruction spiral. And now, if Netanyahu I don't know, retires, dies of old age, it doesn't matter. It won't change the situation anymore. It won't. There's nobody else in Israel who can take over. If you look at the Israeli politicians who are opposing Netanyahu and trying to replace him, they're really a bunch of nobodies. And that's not a coincidence. Netanyahu eliminated everyone who could possibly threaten him on an intellectual level or on a charisma level. So I think that politicians like Bernie Sanders are acting in a very unwise way. If they buy into this myth that the problem is Netanyahu and he's the only one who he's the root of all evil, they're setting themselves up for failure. Because I personally don't think that Netanyahu is a god. I think he's flesh and blood. I think he will not live forever. And one day there's going to be a moment in which he will not be the scapegoat for all the evils that Israel is committing. And then what will Sanders say? Would he say, yeah, well, Sanders is even older than Netanyahu, but
right.
But there are others.
The man's got the verve. Look, I think that the idea is that you just move on to the next person and you blame the next person. I mean, because to your point, that will be bad. I mean, there's a certain parallel I'm hearing between this approach and what happens here in a domestic political realm, where Democrats are able to disguise their own ineptitude politically by saying the Republicans are worse. The Republicans are worse, and then they keep getting even worse because there's no leftward pull in the country. So liberals chase them to the right, and they say, you're going to deal with it, public, because what are you going to do? Vote for the other guy? And if we don't elect a Democrat, then the worst president in the history of America is going to be elected in our stead. And they guarantee that that's going to be the case because of chasing the effect of chasing people to the right is that you do get increasingly right-wing nominees in the Republican Party. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so whether or not JD Vance is technically going to be worse than Donald Trump, potato, who cares? But to your point, whoever fills the void of Netanyahu is also going to be very bad. And part of that has to be, you have to acknowledge that this isn't one of these American political situations where most people want universal health care and neither political party will deliver it. In this case, it seems like the overwhelming majority of the Israeli public actually wants the annexation and occupation of Gaza, the genocide and famine to continue, starvation to continue, to expel the Israeli Arabs from Israel. Like, these are not marginal positions. So why would you expect a politician to be elected by this public that did not want to further that agenda?
No, because a politician is not just somebody who represents an opinion. It's also somebody who needs to do something about it, or to rule in some fashion. And there is nobody other than Netanyahu. That's part of the point. That Netanyahu is in a position where he purged both the left and the right camps in Israel from anyone who is capable. And he's surrounded by inept people because that's how he stays in power. It's not that the next person will be like him. The next person maybe will have similar ideas or similar ideology, although I doubt very much if Netanyahu has any ideology. But the next person will certainly not have the capability of Netanyahu to build allies, to find loopholes in international law, to somehow go around and convince the Israeli business owners and capitalists to stay in the country. Even Netanyahu is not doing a very good job, but he's doing a very good job considering the conditions. So the next person...
Talk to me about that a little bit, because last time you were on, you were saying that the population was feeling strained, that all of the mandatory conscription and the length of time that people were being pulled away from their jobs and having to serve was negatively impacting the economy, that international companies didn't want to invest in Israel because there wasn't a reliable workforce as a consequence of how many people were being tasked with fighting, and that there were genuine economic negative economic consequences for the ongoing siege. What does it look like a year later when you're talking about Netanyahu's part of his sort of power as being the best, it's a struggle, but the best at trying to convince economic developers to stay in the country and to keep the economy going. How much worse is it now than it was a year ago? Are there any sort of new vulnerabilities and threats that have emerged? And what do you see happening to Israel a year, 5 years, 10 years from now if this trend continues and if the relationship with Palestinians continues as it is?
It's very hard to answer your question because the economic data in Israel is so full of disinformation and holes that it's amazing that Israel is not kicked out of every economic organization in the world, like the OECD, for failing to report basic things. The budget, the government budget is a bunch of lies. And this is something that is acknowledged by the chief economists of Israel, where they say, well, there's no relation between the budget and reality. The government just does whatever they want, and it's all on credit. And the major taxpayers, the middle class that bears the brunt of the paying the taxes, has in large parts left the country. But the main economic activity of the state of Israel is war, and this has never been the case in Israel. Even during its worst wars in history, it has never been that war lasts for so long with so many soldiers, and all the other activities are just taking a back seat. No tourism, no academic research, no development of new companies. There are some companies that are able to be sold off to foreign investors because they're trying to get out. So they're working very hard to sell themselves and to find like tech giants in the US who would just buy the whole company so that everybody can just leave. So this is happening, but that's not economic activity. That's economic inactivity. One thing is that the Israeli government broke its own system. Like there are rules and regulations about how much money the reservist soldiers are supposed to be paid. Normally, they're supposed to be paid about the same that they would have been paid in their normal jobs. So if their job is like a low pay job, minimum wage, they would get minimum wage as reservists. If they are making higher wages, they would get the same as reservists. If they're unemployed, they would get an equivalent to their unemployment benefit as reservists. What the government instead did is just put up a number that is very, very high, higher than the average wage. And they pay people with days of reservists, days of reserve duty, whether they do this service or not. In one case, the army wanted meat for the soldiers from like a butcher, and they paid the butcher company with reserve days. So instead of with money, but these reserve days can be converted into money. So it becomes like a new currency, and it's all on credit because there is no income source for this. This is a weird economy, of course, completely unsustainable. There is no generation of value. It's only destruction of value. And because of this, there's a lot of Israelis who are willing to serve in the military because that would be the only way for them to provide for their families. So they go and fight in Gaza and kill a lot of people in Gaza and also risk their own lives. And nevertheless, having, if the Israeli government came up with this idea of bribing people like mercenaries to fight and to kill, and nevertheless, they don't have enough soldiers because so many soldiers are breaking down emotionally, physically, and there are a lot of injured soldiers that are not reported. Like they're not saying how many soldiers are lying in coma in hospitals, and there are a lot of suicides. A lot of soldiers are committing suicide, especially when they start to realize, or they're haunted by the faces of the people that they murder, So on the beginning of June, the Supreme Commander of the Israeli military, Eyal Zamir, said to the government, he said it openly, like to the newspapers, we don't have enough soldiers. The war in Gaza has to end. Please divest yourself from the idea that Israel will conquer Gaza. It's not going to happen. And when he said this, it caused, of course, a political crisis in Israel. And the way that Netanyahu spinned it, because, or not just Netanyahu, but also those opposition people that are supposed to be better than Netanyahu, is instead of saying, oh, well, we really have to end this war, they said, what we need to do is to get the ultra-Orthodox to join the military, and then we'll have enough soldiers. The ultra-Orthodox will not serve. This is a very important part of their culture, of their religion, of their commitment. Whether they are close to Zionism or anti-Zionist, it doesn't matter. They won't become soldiers. So the government, they demanded that the government will legislate a law that will exempt them from military service, or they will leave the government. And Netanyahu was not able to legislate this law because his own party is not supporting it. On June 13th, the ultra-Orthodox parties called for a non-confidence vote against Netanyahu. They are from the opposition, from the coalition, voting against their own government. So clearly, the government was going to fall on June 13th. And then on the morning of June 13th, you may remember this, Israel launched a surprise attack on Iran. Maybe not such a big surprise if you realize what was happening. And the attack on Iran put the ultra-Orthodox parties in an impossible position because they cannot vote against the government when there's a war, especially that the war is against the country that is stronger than Israel. Iran is bigger and stronger than Israel, and everyone were panicking. I said in the beginning of our conversation, Israel didn't have the tools, didn't have the weapons. Everybody knows this. They completely rely on the US to come and save them. And then over the next 12 days after that, so the ultra-Orthodox party ended up voting against their own bill to topple the government. And this gives Netanyahu 6 months of immunity. Nobody can vote against him for 6 months. So he won that battle. And then 12 days, there was a war with Iran in which Iran fired rockets into Israel that caused tremendous damage. Not as much damage as Israel caused in Iran, and the US, of course, but nevertheless, far more than the Israeli public was willing to tolerate, and caused real panic among people. And about 30,000 people just escaped from the country. And because the airport was closed, a lot of people bribed boat owners to sail them to Cyprus. And this is illegal because you can't leave the country without going through passport control. But they did it anyway because they were terrified for their lives. It's not a fun cruise. It's 28 hours in a small boat with all your suitcases. Nobody wants to do this, but they were really afraid. And after 12 days, Trump and Netanyahu were well coordinated, and there was a ceasefire, which basically was Netanyahu's way of telling people, "Oh, you're not happy with me as your prime minister? Well, I have the ability to destroy this country. I can start a war with Iran whenever I want, and I can also stop it. So I don't want to hear any more people calling for non-confidence votes." And it worked. It worked. The Israeli public responded by saying Netanyahu is the great leader who saved us from a terrible disaster, forgetting that 12 days later, he's the one who started this disaster.
I mean, Shir, when you frame it like that, it does make it sound like it's on Netanyahu. It does sort of make it sound like this is all Netanyahu's doing, his puppeteering. And there is an argument for it would be better if he weren't there.
No. The point is that there is our let's say instinct or animal nature, our desires is something that we usually try to control rationally and to think what can we achieve. And I think that leaders like Trump and Netanyahu and others in the far right in the world are all about saying, let's not control our animalistic desires. Let's let them loose. The people who oppose Netanyahu are not didn't say we like Palestinians or we believe Palestinians should have rights. They said we believe Palestinians should have rights on paper so that the world will not boycott us. We believe that we need to create our apartheid system in an invisible way or and mask it as democracy so that we can be part of the international community. And Netanyahu say, why mask it? Let's just do whatever we want. So when you say such a large part of the Israeli population want to kick out the Palestinians or to kill them, that has always been true. Before Netanyahu, it has always been true. But they never dared to say it because they didn't think it's a wise thing to say if there's a poll and you try to say to give the civilized answer. And I think this is the whole point, that Netanyahu has broken down this mask.
Yeah, the Israel is a democracy as a talking point that justifies everything else, all the violations of international law and very undemocratic things that it does. It's never been clear to me how important a keystone that is in creating public consensus around the legitimacy of Israel's project. It makes me reflect differently on the battles around characterizing Israel as an apartheid state and how that has been sort of the red line discursively prior to October 7th for like what you were or were not able to say about Israel. My friend Katie Halper was a kind of a regular over at the Hill where I used to work before I was fired for covering Israel critically last year. And she was let go first after she read a monologue in which she described Israel as an apartheid state and quoted B'Tselem and, both Israeli and international humanitarian organizations' evidence for why they had assessed it as such. And not that it should matter, but Katie Halper is also Jewish. I mean, I think that's part of what made them angrier about it, to be honest. But and she was told summarily that they weren't going to ask for her services anymore after she gave this radar and they didn't allow it to air. And it was all about Israel as an apartheid state, Israel as an apartheid state. And reflecting on how now the emphasis is on, but Israel is a democracy. Oh, but Israel doesn't throw gay people off roofs. Like all of this kind of narrative. It's all one and the same. And it's all about making this broader argument that it's not about what Israel does, it's about who Israel is. And in the same way that America has been unfaithful to its ideals as a democracy, I sit here as a Black American whose parents were born into America's own apartheid state. The abstraction from what are we doing to, this is the ideal of who we are, has enabled America to have cover for its own crimes and now Israel as well. And it is, as I'm reflecting in this moment, it has never been more important to continue to push and expose Israel, the United States, and any other country who's living in this hypocrisy for what they really are and what they're really doing. And these polls showing what the Israeli public wants and the actual commitment of war crimes, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank, that is what I think has finally shifted public opinion, because you cannot believe that in Coleman Hughes's framing, Israel is the quote unquote good guy when it's so obvious that they're betraying their own stated values, America's stated values, and what it means to be a good guy, regardless, frankly, of what you think about Palestinians or how much of this sort of anti-Arab Islamophobic rhetoric you might internalize. It's kind of beside the point at this point because it's so obvious. I'm all that being said, I'm very conflicted because I'm interested in your sort of perception of what's going on in America and then my perception of what's going on in Israel, because it really is a mixed bag. I mean, at the same time, maybe because public opinion is shifting so hard against Israel, you're getting these really bizarre, sporadic outbursts. I don't know if you saw this one from David Mamet. He's like a pretty notable Jewish playwright here, who people, I think, really liked up until this moment.
It goes back to what I said earlier, which is the question is how that's funny. I don't get it. What's going on here? Which is why I wrote these books that you're kind enough to call polemical.
Two of them. I've also read a bunch of other ones, and they're not all polemical. It seems the squishy thing is that your read?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Here's the thing: is to go back again. I'm a Jew, right? The river to the sea means kill all the Jews. Support the Intifada means kill all the Jews. People in hijabs and people in kafiyas standing on tables and screaming at Jewish children, storming into classrooms and breaking windows means kill all the Jews. For you to say, on the other hand, there may be some people out there that were involved in peaceful protest, it's a loathsome piece of anti-Semitism. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Thank you for talking to me. Yeah.
And that was David Mamet.
So you consider promote his book on this podcast called Talk Easy. I don't actually know what the lead up was to him having that sort of meltdown, other than the host referring to some of his books as polemical. But this is a guy, to be so clear, liberal. You know, his Nepo baby daughter starred in one of our great millennial defining, era defining programs, Girls, Jojo Mamet. Like, there's a sort of a meltdown happening. And it almost feels like an escalation of the remaining supporters of what Israel is doing, or just Zionism generally speaking, almost as a reaction to the obvious shift in public opinion.
I think the definition of polemic is that you are making the case for some argument based on emotional conviction rather than on actual arguments, right? Rather than basing your argument. And if you're not able to explain your position without storming out of the room in the middle of your own sentence, is because maybe you don't have the full argument. You're really starting just expressing an emotion. And I do think that this is now the state that Israel is in, which is actually the state of taking revenge. And this is the reason that Israel is committing genocide, or this is how they justify it to themselves, is by saying, well, we're taking revenge. Netanyahu used that word to say this is an act of revenge. But anyone, especially Jews who grow up on biblical stories and traditional stories from Jewish history about revenge, they know very well that revenge is, first of all, never successful. It always ends up destroying the person itself. It always leads to tragedy. It's not a strategy. It's not a policy. It's a curse. So when you have the Israelis in this emotional surge and this hate and this racism and violence, well, it's very scary. Of course, it's scary, and they are killing a lot of people. But you cannot wage a war in modern times, and you cannot organize an army, and you cannot organize an economy just based on rabid emotions, right? You need, at some point, to have technology and arguments and write financial reports to convince investors, that sort of thing. The investors are not going to always continue to invest based on polemics, right? Based on these rants of people who call anyone who criticizes Israel an anti-Semite. So no, if you and if you understand that this is really the state of affairs, then the real question that comes from this is, where is this going?
Yes.
And I think that if you now read Haaretz, not a year ago, but now, when people are reflecting on the horrible pictures of starving children in Gaza and saying, well, this is the picture of the end of Israel. Because, and we are also victims of this starvation. And when they write this, on the one hand, I get sick to my stomach because you are starving people to death and then complaining that you're also victims of your own genocide because of this. Well, but I also agree with them in the sense that this is indeed a dead end. There's no day after in which Israel will say, okay, what can they say? We've killed them all. We're sorry. We'll sign an agreement now. No, there's really nothing more to say except hope that the Palestinian leadership that will come will find it in its heart to create a system of forgiveness. And now it's very much too much to ask from Palestinians in this moment, of course. But there are, of course, a lot of Israelis who are already jumping, and saying, oh, maybe they will create a kind of truth and reconciliation committee like they did in South Africa, and so that or in Rwanda, so that we will have the ability to say sorry and maybe get forgiveness. But that's a bit jumping the gun.
Yeah, Americans here are, people are hitting the two-state solution stuff again real hard. The narrative is, this is terrible. We have to let food in. There has to be a two-state solution, but also Hamas has to give up all power and have no leadership and disarm. And the hostages have to be released first. Like that's the little dance they've gone back to.
I'm not surprised because first of all, it has always been like the lip service that you can say, oh, the two-state solution is our way of saying that we don't go head to head against international law, without actually recognizing the fact that it doesn't matter how many states you have, there have been atrocities committed and people have to stand trial in international courts for them. But the other thing is that after the Holocaust, there was this idea that the West promoted, that instead of rehabilitating the victims of the Holocaust, the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and making sure that they are protected as full citizens with equal rights in Europe, where they were persecuted, instead, let's create a state for them. And the state will be, instead of really dealing with what does it mean to commit a genocide and to take responsibility for it. And so the easy thing is to say, oh, well, why don't you go and go to your state? And I think that's now what people are thinking. Oh, let's address this by telling Palestinians, go to your state. And as if giving Palestinians a state is somehow a solution to genocide. It's just not related to it. It's not on the same level.
That's actually, that framing is stunning. The framing of Israel as the two-state solution for the Holocaust, and playing it forward and attempting to play it forward in Palestine, shipping Palestinians off to Uganda or whatever cockamamie plan people are dreaming up periodically. That parallel is really haunting. And my God, I would have hoped that we could have learned from history instead of repeating it. But here we are. I don't want to be so bleak. We've circled around this issue of what the next steps are. The last time, and the answer, I mean, we're both just kind of like, the damage is, I mean, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to say things that are demobilizing, because there are million, there are still, 2 million odd people alive, God willing, for whom this is not over.
Absolutely. And there's still a lot that we can do, and we should do every day, to ask ourselves, what are we doing in order to stop the genocide and to make Israel accountable, stop the weapons.
Well, can we? I haven't asked you very much about BDS. What can we do to stop the weapons?
Yeah, I think we have to act within our social circles. This is the only way to have effective BDS action, is to ask yourself, first of all, who are you? Are you a member of a union? Are you a student in a university? Are you a member of a church or a synagogue or a mosque? Work within your circle to see what you can do collectively. And then, of course, you have the 3 letters: boycott, divestment, sanctions. The boycott is something that every one of us can do by choosing not to buy products. And I would recommend that people don't just, make your own list, but rather join an existing campaign so that the companies feel that there is a concentrated boycott effort on these particular companies. Not every company that is complicit with Israel's crimes should be boycotted as the first priority. Of course, it's good to boycott them all, but let's really focus on the ones that there is a call so the company knows we lost sales because of what we do. Then you have the divestment. This is more on an organizational level. Your university, your church, your city hall are all invested, and they have portfolios, and you should get transparency to see what they're invested in and make sure that there are no complicit companies on that list, no Israeli companies and no companies that profit from Israel's genocide. There's a very good report that was written by the UN and just published on July 4th, which talks about the companies that are complicit in genocide, international companies. And then the sanctions is, of course, something we cannot do as individuals. Only governments can impose sanctions, but we as individuals can pressure our governments. And not just the federal government, but also the state government and also our even city hall. And this is something that each one of us can do, and we can be successful if we do it collectively.
Yeah. I saw a TikTok this morning that informed me that the flowers at Trader Joe's are a no-go. So I learned something new every day. From the BDS front, it's worth noting that Trump, there was such backlash against this policy that Trump immediately reversed it. But the Department of Homeland Security was trying to tie whether or not you got FEMA, like a federal emergency aid from a hurricane or a flood or whatever, to whether or not you support Israel. That is very reflective of these sort of anti-BDS laws that we've seen across the country over the last, decade or so. And so the bipartisan backlash against this was so bad. It's so not America first to say, if you're an American whose house got hit by a tornado, you've got to pledge loyalty to Israel if you want any federal relief, that they backtracked, I think within 24 hours. But the fact of that effort even happening, the fact that was even an idea that someone tried to promulgate, is also really terrifying, and maybe does speak to your point about the power of these boycott movements.
I'll say again, nothing is pulling down the U.S. empire faster than Israel.
Yeah. Well, Shir, thank you so much for spending the time with us here today. I'm sorry. I felt weirdly optimistic the last time you came on. I think because talking about the concrete, dock workers across the world who are, really directly blocking weapons to Israel. It was before the election. I felt like there was some potential of a change in policy that may or may not occur.
It is happening.
This time
it is happening. You can be sad and optimistic at the same time.
Yeah. Can I?
Yeah, I think so. Of course it's sad. Of course, I'm very sad about the people who are starving to death. This is this is horrible, and it's only human to feel emotion. But being optimistic means that you believe that through action we can improve the situation in the future, and we can.
Thank you for inviting me to keep the faith, as I invite the audience to do at the end of every episode. Shir, can you tell people where to find more of you and your work, information on BDS or anything else you're working on the internet and beyond?
I do recommend that people go to the BDS website, bdsmovement.net, or follow BDS on various social media channels to know what are the new campaigns that you can join, because we're more effective if we're working collectively.
Amazing. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Thanks to all of you for tuning into this episode of Bad Faith Podcast. You know, you can get an additional episode of Bad Faith every Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.